because it is time now for another question submitted online, and a viewer writes to us, the Bush tax cuts are set to expire. What's more important, retiring the federal debt or keeping taxes as low as possible? Mr. Paul, your response to that?
Both. You need to do both, and part of the problem we have had as Republicans is that we have often done a good job cutting taxes. The Bush tax cuts came about when Republicans controlled all three branches. They were the right thing to do. They give predictability to business. They give more capital funds to business. They were a good thing, but they should have cut spending. I ran in my primary and won in the Republican primary by standing up and saying, you know what, we as Republicans didn't do a good enough job. And the Democrats are doing worse, but we as Republicans didn't do a good enough job to cut spending. It's not a revenue problem. It's a spending problem. We have to cut spending, we have to be serious about it, and we have to look at every program in the budget, all across the board. Does that mean we're going to eliminate it or cut Social Security by 40% or whatever he's going on about? No. What it means, though, is you look at every program and say, could it be done at the federal level or the local level? Could it be done by private enterprise or the government? This test needs to go through every individual program in the budget, and we need to be serious about it. It's the only way we'll ever get our house in order.
I'm sorry. All right, Mr. Conway, you have 90 seconds.
Well, thank you. I have said that raising taxes is something that we shouldn't do in a time of a recession. That's where I am. But we need to get back to the pay-as-you-go rules, and we need to get back to the rules that were in place during the Clinton years when a Democratic president actually turned to a Republican president and said, here you go, here's an economy that created 22 million jobs over the last 8 years, and here are surpluses as far as the eye can see. That's what we need to get back to. And we also need to have a jobs plan. You know, I'm a different type of Democrat. I actually have a jobs plan. If you go to my website at jackconway.org, you can hear me, you can see me, and you can look at us talking about it. The difference between the two candidates up here tonight is I actually have a jobs plan. Rand Paul has no plan whatsoever. Our plan calls for a 20% tax credit. We call it a hometown tax credit. And the estimates are that would create 11,000 jobs in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. It would create 750,000 jobs nationwide. Rand Paul's plan for jobs, here's what he has said. He has said that some people are just going to have to get a job with lower wages, and we're going to have some tough love. Those are his words, not mine. That's not a jobs plan. That's callousness. The same sort of callousness that calls for balancing the budget on the backs of seniors by calling for a $2,000 Medicare deductible. The same sort of callousness that calls Social Security a Ponzi scheme that ought to be privatized. I'll stand up with a real jobs plan and get this country and this Commonwealth back to work.
Mr. Paul, you now have 30 seconds.
Let's be real clear. I want to understand where we are now on the issue. You were for the Bush tax cuts originally. You were against him when you wanted to be the Democrats' Democrat in the primary. You wanted to make sure they knew you were the liberal Democrat that would support President Obama. You were against the majority of them. Exact words a couple of months ago. Now you're for some of them, but I'm not sure exactly what's going on, because I know you specifically said you were for bringing the estate tax back. You said 45%, and you were going to have some exemptions.
All right, gentlemen, thanks. Because of where we are in the debate at this point, the next question posed by Tom McKee, each of you will have 60 seconds to answer plus the rebuttal. So, Tom, go ahead.
Clyde, thank you very much. Educators throughout the Commonwealth continue to struggle with unfunded mandates put upon them by the federal government, mostly in the No Child Left Behind legislation. Since that bill is due for reauthorization, what should be kept in, what should be kept out, and how would you do that? And should the federal government even have a hand in regulating education to begin with?
Mr. Conway, your response.
Well, first of all, I want to go back to Dr. Paul's last answer. He was saying I was trying to be a liberal Democrat. I'm not going to take a lecture on being a liberal from a guy who thinks that drugs aren't a pressing issue, who said that nonviolent activity should never be a crime, and who said states ought to be able to legalize marijuana. I'm not going to take a lecture on liberalism from someone like that. Now, on the issue of education, the federal government makes up about 10% of our education budget. I don't want to do away with the Federal Department of Education as my opponent wants to do. I bet if I were to ask the audience here tonight, or you at home, to raise your hands if you know someone who's furthered their education with a Pell Grant, I bet many of you would raise your hands. Dr. Paul doesn't seem to understand that. He doesn't seem to understand Kentucky. He doesn't seem to understand what it means to struggle to further your education. So No Child Left Behind can be improved. The testing system needs to be tweaked. We need to stand up and help some of our failing schools. But I'm not for being callous and eliminating the Federal Department of Education.
Mr. Paul.
No Child Left Behind was a huge mistake. Republicans passed it, but it really went against our real philosophy of believing in more local control of schools. Interestingly, though, the teachers hate it. Teachers often vote Democrat, but many teachers will hear that I'm opposed to No Child Left Behind, and I'm opposed to Washington dictating what you do in your classrooms. And I think we'll actually get quite a bit of the teacher vote this time around. No Child Left Behind doubled the size of the Department of Education, doubled the number of employees, and took control out of the local hands of superintendents and principals and teachers and parents. We need to make control of our schools more local. Now, some would throw up their arms and say, oh my goodness, he's going to get rid of federal involvement. There still might be student loans that are done at the federal level, but the thing is should we have more control at the federal level or less? I think we need less control at the federal level, and we need more control by our local teachers and parents and superintendents.
Mr. Paul, thank you. 30 seconds, Mr. Conway.
He just said that in his view of the future, there might be federal loans available at the student level or federal level. I'm asking you out there tonight to think of people who have needed federal loans and federal help to further their education. Doing away with that, doing away with helping people further their education, that will never be an option with me. We have very different views about what it means to put Kentucky first.
Mr. Conway, Mr. Paul, thank you both. We are at the point of our program this evening where we will turn to the candidates for closing statements. They each have 2 minutes for their closing statement, and we begin with Mr. Paul.
Thank you very much for having me here this evening. I'm proud to be a Kentuckian. I'm proud to be an American. I'm proud of the American way of life. Now, what does that mean? It means that our way of life is different than other countries. You know, I'm not proud of the Cuban system. I'm proud of the American system. People fly from all around the world to come and have their health care in our great country. We need to be proud of the system that created that. We need to not have a president who flies around the world and disparages America, disparages our way of life. The American system is of freedom. It's of individual responsibility. It's of a government that is restrained by a Constitution. The Constitution isn't meant to restrain you, it's meant to restrain your government. Franklin once said that those who give up their liberty for security will have neither. We need to remember that. We have a lot of problems, and at every turn, there's a fork in the road. You can go one direction or the other. You can go in the direction of more individual freedom, of less government, of more individual entrepreneurship, or you can go in the direction that government has the answer to everything. The problem is that government doesn't do many things well. When they passed the stimulus plan, you know, in the paper recently, they reported 77,000 dead people got it. Does that not just appall us that we run these massive deficits and are struggling to finance things that we want to finance, like the entitlements, and yet 77,000 dead people were sent a check? To make matters worse, if your mother got it and she was deceased and you wanted to send it back, no provision in the legislation for getting it back. 17,000 criminals got checks from the government. We need more local control. Is it going to be all local versus all federal? Obviously not. That oversimplifies the equation. But what we want is someone who believes in us,
Mr.
in America,
Paul, thank you.
And more
Sorry
local
to have to interrupt, but at this point we turn now to Mr. Conway for a 2-minute closing statement.
Well, thank you, Clyde. Thank you to our panel. Thank you to the great people of Northern Kentucky for having me here tonight. This election is about who's going to put Kentucky first. I appreciate the discussion of Cuba. All along the campaign trail, I've heard discussion of Greece and the Bolsheviks. But you know what? It's about who's going to put the Commonwealth of Kentucky first. You know, the special interests in Washington, they have enough people standing up for them. You need a United States Senator who has experience like I have as your Attorney General holding people accountable. We need to go to Washington and hold them accountable. We need to hold Wall Street accountable. And my opponent has a worldview where he says that the Constitution doesn't allow the federal government to do all these things. And the end result is that he would have no federal government, holding the bankers on Wall Street accountable and making certain they never do this to us again. As your Attorney General, I've gone after the drug problem, tried to hold people accountable. I've gone after the pharmaceutical companies that gouged us, gone after the oil companies that gouged us. I want to take that record. I want to take that record of taking a public office and treating it as a public trust, and I want to do that as your next United States Senator in Washington. And you have a fundamental choice to make here in about 22 days. Do you want a United States Senator who understands that drugs are indeed a pressing issue in the Commonwealth of Kentucky? Do you want a United States Senator like me who understands that sometimes when activity is nonviolent, think Bernie Madoff, that it ought to be a crime? Do you want a United States Senator like me who will stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves, like those people who benefit from the Civil Rights Act, who benefit from the Americans with Disabilities Act? I ask for your vote because I am not for a $2,000 deductible for Medicare like my opponent. I'll never balance the budget on the backs of seniors. And I humbly tonight thank you for having me here, and I ask for your vote.
Mr. Conway, Mr. Paul, thank you very much for agreeing to be with us tonight and sharing your thoughts so that the voters might assess you both. Our thanks as well to our panel, Scott Reynolds from Wave 3 in Louisville, Amanda Van Benschoten from the Kentucky Inquirer, and Tom McKee with us from 9 News. We also want to take this opportunity to thank our sponsors, the Northern Kentucky Chamber of Commerce, Northern Kentucky University, the League of Women Voters, the Kentucky Inquirer, Wave 3, and WCPO TV. This concludes our broadcast. From all of us at 9 News and Wave 3, thank you again for watching. Have a good night.